This lesson we're going to be using a custom formula and generating a custom function within spreadsheets that we can use in order to generate an invoice number. So it's going to be using the date, the month, and whatever the last invoice number is and incrementing it by 1. So we've got the last invoice number that we're tracking here, so that was 9-4, and that's where we're returning back 9-5 when we generate whatever the next invoice number is that's available. So that's an equal sign, and we just select generate invoice number, and that's going to generate whatever the next invoice number is that's available. And if we were to update this, so if our last invoice was 9.7, we go back to the example, let's generate another invoice number, and this is going to increment the 9.8. And also, if we don't have a last number there, and if we go to generate an invoice number, it's going to take whatever the year, the month, and have a starting number of 1 for this invoice number. Go ahead and set up your spreadsheet. So all you need is a cell where you're going to be selecting and generating the invoice from. And then also I've included another spreadsheet where I'm going to actually get some values out of the spreadsheet. So this is going to stand as a previous invoice that we might have created. And this can be a number of different ways that you can source out this data, or you can just let it generate invoices from other lists. So in this case, we're going to be generating the invoice from the last value within the cells, and we've got our invoice number here, so it's using the current year and month and then incrementing that last number there. So the -4 will increment to -5 when we generate the next invoice, because that's going to be the next sequential invoice that we want to generate. So under the extensions, app script, go ahead and open up your app script editor and create a brand new function. In this case, we're going to be calling the function generate invoice number. So this will give us a meaningful name for the invoice number. We want to select the current active spreadsheet. So that's whatever current spreadsheet is currently active. So we're going to use a variable called SS, selecting out the spreadsheet app, and then get the active spreadsheet. So that gives us the spreadsheet object to work with. And as well, as you're building this out, you can use the logger to make sure that you are getting the proper content, and then I'm just going to run the function. So then we got the spreadsheet object, and we can select out the separate sheets from the spreadsheet object. So we want to get whatever the current sheet is. So we want to just select that, and we can use the get active sheet. So if we, for instance, had some values that we want to get from this active sheet, we can get it from the sheet object. If we want to get some values from another sheet, in this case, that's what we want to do. We want to select the sheet object, and then we want to get the sheet by name, and then select the name of the sheet, and this is expecting a string value. So we're going to select a sheet called Invoices, and that's going to be this sheet over here where we've got the numbers. So you might vary of where you're getting that data from. And then what we also want to do next, and you can also log these out, and these are going to be returned back as sheet objects. So we've got our sheet object there that we're working with. Next, we want to pick up whatever the current date is, as we need the current date to be used in order to calculate what the invoice month and year is going to be. So we just select the date object, and this is similar as JavaScript date object. If we want to select a range of values, in this case we have the range within the invoices sheet. So we're doing a variable, setting up the log range, and we're using the log sheet. And here we're going to select the range. So using the get range, we're selecting the starting row, starting column, starting row, starting column, the number of rows, and then the number of columns that we want to select. So what we're doing is we're selecting out these values here, so A2 and B2, and that's selecting the range that we want to use. And this should return back a range object for us. And you can again check that within the log as you're building this out. So it looks like we did throw an error there. And that's because I need to actually use the get range method, so I didn't add that in. So let's go ahead and we'll add that in. and we see that we've got the range. And this is a good thing about using the but debugger. This gives you an ability to catch any errors that you might have along the way as you're constructing your code. So let's select out the year out of the current date, and we can use the same as JavaScript methods where we get the full year. It's going to return back the year in 4 digits, and then we're going to return back the month. And once again, we use the concurrent date, and then we get the month. And this is going to return back an integer value, and months are going to be 0 indexed. So that means that we need to add +1 to the month in order to get it starting at 1. So otherwise it'll just start at 0. So January would be 0, and we typically know January as being 1 whenever we see the calendars being written. So let's go ahead and we're going to get the values from that spreadsheet where we have the 2 values that we want to pick up. And we've already selected the log range, so we can use this range object and then return back the values that we have using the get values method. And this is going to return back an array of values. And once again, I'll log that out to the log so that you can see what's being returned back. We've got the values being returned back. So we've got the first one as a date object, and the second one is going to be just the 9-4. Sometimes the spreadsheet will automatically default this to a date. So in this case, you need to go back to the format and just make sure that you've got plain text checked off. So if you're throwing an error, if you're getting a date object being returned back, whenever you use the dashes, it sometimes defaults the cell data type, and we want to keep it as just regular text data type. So this is returning it back properly, and if we look at the structure of it, it's a nested array within another array. So we want to just draw out the values of that contents of the array, so that the nested array, so we can just do 0 to indicate that that's going to be the index value. So that's going to return back those values. And if we want to get the second item within the array, we can use the index value of 1 in order to return back the 9-4. So that's going to return back 9-4. And now we can use this in order to check to see whatever the last number is. So let's create another variable. So our last number is going to be the values with the index value of 1, and that's going to now it's going to be returned back to 9-4, and that will give us an indication of whatever our last invoice number was. So this is where we've got the condition where we're going to check to see if, first of all, if there is a last number. So if it's blank, then we want to start out at the first value, or if the last number is equal to null. So if there's no blank value in there, then we know that we want to start at the first available value. And also let's take the last number and we'll split the last number. And if we're split it by the dash, so it's expecting a string, so this is a built-in string method, we return back the first part of it, and this will give us the number there that we're using for the dash. So we split it, and if this is not equal to whatever the current month is, so this will allow us to move to the next month as we are generating the invoices. So each month it will start out at a value of 1 or whatever we're going to be set it to. So we're just checking to see if that is not there. And so if we don't have 1, then we can set up and set the last number, and we can equal that to whatever the month is and concatenate it -1. So that's going to be our starting point. So if we don't have, if none of these criteria are true, then we create a brand new last number using the current month, and we do a -1 for our first invoice. If we do have a value there, then what we want to do is we're going to split the value there, and we want to first pick up the value that we have, and that can be within the second digit there, so 9-4. So we want to extract out the 4, and we want it as an integer. So using parse integer, turning it into an integer, then we get the last number, and we can split the last number using the string method, splitting it by the dash, and then we want to return back whatever the matching value is, so using the index value of 1, and this should return back our current value that's within the last number there. And we can also see that within the log there. So let's see what we've got logged out there within the log. So right now we've got a .4, so that's returning back that second digit there. So if we don't use the index value of 1, it's gonna just return back the value of 4. So it's going to be returning back the split there of the 1. And because we're using parse integer, it's automatically converting it into a number. So we don't actually have to, it's returning back an array actually. So if we don't use the parse, and if we don't use the last number split, it's going to return back the 9 and then the 4 as we're splitting it by the dash. So that gives us a integer value to work with, and here we can just increment the counter plus 1, and then generating the last number. So this is going to be the last invoice number that we want to use, and doing it plus, so concatenating the dash, and then here we're going to add in whatever the counter value is. So it's going to essentially increment it by 1, and then here we can create their last variable by generating our invoice number and taking the value of the year and adding to it the dash, and then getting whatever the last number that we have. And I got to update this to be let, so because we're assigning it to a const. So that's going to be our next invoice number. So if our last one was -6, and we'll update this as well to be -6, and if we run it, that's going to give us a 9-7 value there. If we don't have any values here, and if we run the code, let's just make sure it works. So we're starting out at 9 is what we want to return back in the cell within the formula. So we're returning back the invoice number, and that will populate the cell with whatever the invoice number is. And let's just save that, and we can get rid of our log. We won't need that anymore. And now we can go into our spreadsheet, and if we want to add in and generate an invoice number, we add in the formula that we've just created, and that will generate the next available invoice number. If we already have an invoice number there, so let's say we have the 9-4, and now if we go back here, it will generate whatever the next available invoice number is going to be. So that's generating a 9-5. And unfortunately, with formulas, you're not able to update the cells in the sheets other than the one that's being returned back. When we're creating this type of functionality, that we don't have a way that we can update this other than manually. So if you are getting this value, if you're getting it outside of a spreadsheet, that's another way that you can get that. And then if you're generating those invoices and generating an ID value, you can also pick those up within Drive. So there's a number of ways to do that. So this has just been a simple example of how to generate the invoice number and how to create a custom formula within Sheets.